All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, I Can't Focus When ADHD Impacts Your Child's Math and Writing Performance, with our wonderful speaker this morning, Ann Dolan. Ann Dolan, who has a master's degree in education, has a strong conviction that school doesn't have to to place stress on children and parents. Based on her nearly 30 years of experience, she has developed practical strategies that she shares to help kids succeed and make the most of their academic journey. Anne has a degree in child psychology and a master's in special education. She is a former public school teacher, mother of two, author, and advocate for kids with ADHD and learning issues. She founded Educational Connections in 1998, tutoring one student at her dining room table. Today, her company has grown to employ more than 120 tutors, executive function coaches, and college consultants who provide virtual support to K 12 students in the DC area and beyond. Anne is also the author of the award winning book, Homework Made Simple: Tips, Tools, and Solutions for Stress Free Homework, and her latest book, Getting Past Procrastination: How to Get Your Kids Organized, Focused, and Motivated Without Being the Bad Guy. Please give a warm welcome to Ann Dolan.
Thank you so much, Mary Beth. It is awesome to be here. I love being a part of the Parent Resource Center. So thank you so much for having me. As you mentioned, for the last 30 years as a classroom teacher and actually owning Educational Connections, next year will be our 25th year in business. I talk to parents all the time, and they call our office looking for help for their kids. Here are some things that they often say to us. Just getting my child to sit down and focus on math specifically is a battle. And right now, parents are reporting that their kids have a lot of gaps in math, especially if they took an important class last year or the year before that they missed out on a lot of content when they were in these large Zoom rooms, specifically like algebra, for example. Other parents say, I'm worried that my daughter won't be able to keep up. And if it's this hard now, what's it going to be like later on? I feel like I'm constantly nagging him about his writing assignments. Writing is a real battle. And then others say, I've got other kids to worry about, not just this one, even though maybe there's one child in your family that requires a lot of attention. Now, clearly, parents are worried. But on the other hand, here's what kids say. Why do I have to know this? It's so stupid. Am I ever really going to use this in real life? Who has heard that? Mom, don't micromanage me. I'll do it eventually. I promise I'll turn it in. Have you heard things like that? Well, it's easy to think when we have these kids that have difficulty with even the basics, like knowing exactly what they have to do. Having a plan to do it, sitting down at the table and executing on a task well enough to get it done. When our kids struggle with things like this, it's easy to think, maybe she's lazy, or perhaps he's unmotivated, or maybe school's just not for him. But typically when we see this happening, not just last week or the week before, but we see a chronic issue over time, it's often that we're dealing with something called executive function. Well, what are these executive function skills in the first place? Well, they're actually these cognitive processes behind the frontal lobe in your brain. And they're really, really, really important for school success. They have to do with things like focus, initiation of a task, just getting started, especially if you don't want to do it, having a plan and being organized to see it to fruition, self-monitoring, knowing you're off task and self-correcting, shifting, putting down one thing, starting another, organizing your materials. Before it was staying organized with binders, backpacks, folders. These days, it's more about digital files, emotional control, keeping your emotions in check. But today, we're going to talk a lot about this other executive function skill called working memory. And it's really, really important for success, specifically in math and writing. So often when parents hear about these executive function skills, they think, this focus and getting it done thing, it sounds kind of a lot like ADHD. What's the difference? Well, here's the thing. ADHD, which stands for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is really threefold. There's three different types. There's the hyperactive type. We know these kids kind of seems like they have a motor going inside of them, and they're sometimes impulsive, calling out in class. But then there's the inattentive type, and this looks really different. These are the kids that kind of seem a little spacey. And oftentimes they sit in class and they look like they're paying attention, but they're really not. And they get bits of information here or there. So when they go home to do their homework, they're kind of at a loss and they often feel dejected. And then there's the combined type, a little bit of both. Now, here's the thing about ADHD. Everybody that has a diagnosis of ADHD also has these executive function weaknesses. But not everybody who has these executive function weaknesses, and I would argue many of us do, meet the criteria for ADHD. So that's the connection. Now, just a moment ago, I mentioned this thing called working memory and that it's important to math and writing. Here's why. Working memory actually isn't your brain's short-term memory. It's not long-term memory. It's your ability to juggle multiple thoughts in your head at one time and then keep that in mind when executing on a task. So it's really important in school for solving problems, for getting things done, for completing tasks. Let me give you a couple of examples. This is one of my favorite because, we can all relate to this. When your child's little, say elementary school, you say something like, hey, Jimmy, go up to your room, brush your teeth, put your coat on, and don't forget your mittens. All right, so Jimmy's got three things to do: teeth, coat, mittens, right? He comes down, maybe he has his coat on, but he doesn't have his mittens, and he certainly hasn't brushed his teeth. Why is that? Is it because he didn't want to do these things and please you? Is it because, he doesn't care? No, it's because these three things in his head at one time are a lot to manage. He probably has weak executive function skills. We see this in academics all the time. Okay, here's an example in writing. It's super taxing for working memory. Okay, I have to have a good topic sentence that explains what I'm going to write about. Oh, I have to spell these words correctly. Did I use enough vocabulary? Do I have capital letters? Is my punctuation correct? All these things juggling in your head. We see this a lot in reading too. Oh, wait, what's important here? Who is that character again? Oh, shoot. What's the main idea? You've got a lot going on. And then we see it in math. Math, especially when we see, I'll take an example of solving an algebraic equation. Oh, now what do I do first? What's the first step? How do I get x by itself? And then I have to multiply. Oh, I have to divide. I have to make that a fraction. And then I have to do this. Again, a lot to juggle. So we can see why our kids have difficulties specifically in math and writing, and sometimes to some degree, although that not as much in reading. So I've actually put this together for you. If your child struggles in these areas, what I would recommend is grabbing your phone really quick. You don't have to look at it the whole time of this presentation, but now it might be helpful to text the number 55444 and type in the word homework. And I've composed an article for you on specific strategies dealing with these issues, specifically during homework time. So text 55444 and the word homework, it will come straight to your inbox. So let's talk a little bit about writing specifically. We know that kids that have difficulty in writing have working memory deficits, but they don't know they have working memory issues. How they feel is overwhelmed, like this is going to be really hard for me and underprepared. I don't really know exactly what I'm supposed to do. So when a student feels like that, they're not going to say, let's get to it. This sounds like fun. They're going to say, writing, I hate this. And they're going to avoid, or they're going to put the least amount of work possible into the assignment just to get it done. So at home, what can you do as a parent to help with this process? First, you can make the environment ripe for motivation. And that means that you want to set the stage by making sure your child has a generally quiet area to do their work. So it wouldn't be in a room where the TV is going, or they have access to an Xbox. Those wouldn't be good places. For younger kids, you might want to put them in earshot of you. So sometimes for really young kids, doing homework all alone might feel too isolating because they may need help for it every now and then. For older kids, sometimes they're okay doing homework in their bedroom. Sometimes it's inherently too distracting. So you may want to experiment with different places. But for writing, you'll also want to set the stage to make sure that they can actually do the physical task. What I've found with young kids, elementary schoolers, is that they often get fatigued when writing because they don't have great fine motor skills. So to compensate, they'll grasp the pencil or the pen too tightly. And over time, that tight grip fatigues them. So what I would recommend is experimenting with different pencil grips. You can get different types on Amazon and see which ones work for your child. Also, consider getting a slant board. And a slant board is just basically a little board, or you can set up multiple folders so that your child is writing at a slant. And that way they can't push so hard, and that relieves some of the fatigue. But for older kids that they're not writing so much anymore, they're typing, I like an external keyboard like the Logitech mechanical keyboard. Here's why. Often the keyboard on a laptop, the keys are flush with the panel. And for kids that need that sensory motor tactile feeling, they do better with raised keys. And you can also make the keyboard more interesting with this one in particular, because the keys light up and you can change it. So novelty is interesting to kids with ADHD. And in fact, this is my son's recommendation. And a lot of kids have said, oh my gosh, I love that keyboard. It makes things easier for me. So we've dealt with the physical aspect of getting started. Sometimes, however, kids will have difficulty organizing their thoughts. And we find this all the time in our tutoring, is that our kids are smart. They can tell us a story a mile long and it's really good. But you say, oh, awesome, write that down. It's a different story. So how do you get your kids' great thoughts onto paper when they have to do something hard? For example, a compare and contrast essay, which is inherently very difficult. One way is to use graphic organizers. Graphic organizers are basically just a visual framework that shows relationships between things. And when kids can write out their notes into a graphic organizer, it actually helps doing the next step, which is writing it out or typing it out into paragraph form, a gazillion times easier. I've also found that for younger kids that may not be at the place where they're writing a longer essay, they may need help getting their thoughts down on paper. So often when we work with kids, and by the way, kids are always much more willing to work with us as tutors or executive function coaches because we don't have that emotional barrier with them that often a parent does. They will, even if they have difficulty, they'll get started. And that's the key, is to help your child get started. So for younger kids, if they're really resistant to writing, you might say to them, okay, tell me what you want that topic sentence to be. Oh, I love that. That's great. Let me type that first one for you. Brilliant. I can see why you wrote that. It makes me want to hear more. Okay, what would you like your second sentence to be? Oh, I love it. Type that in. How about the third sentence? Oh, fabulous. That really supports your topic sentence. What about the next one? I love it. And that's when the child takes over. They just need help getting started. Now, for older kids, that might feel a little bit juvenile, and it is. And basically, our goal is to create independence later on. As a parent, your goal is to really just help your child to get started and then step away. When kids are older, they're going to want to do things on their own, and they should. So here are some things that we found to be really helpful for them. One is to use the microphone feature in Google Docs. Most students are extremely familiar with the Google Suite programs. And by using voice to text software, it really helps them get their thoughts onto paper. And often that's all they need to get going. There's also another software called R-E-V, which I really love, and I've used it myself for a number of years. I found it to be super helpful. When I'm writing an article or a blog, at first it's like, oh, I have all these ideas, but it honestly, I can see how kids feel like this. It's overwhelming to put that together and to make it flow. And so Rev allows you to, just like voice to text software, speak what you want to write about. But the difference with Rev is that once you do that and you put what you want to say and do a document, you just press the Rev button. It gets emailed to somebody who's on the other end and then transcribes it for you. And the transcription means that the words are spelled correctly. The ums, things like that are taken out, and it's in paragraph form. So it's neatly typed out for you. And this is helpful because from there, it's much easier for you because it's been cleaned up to some degree. It's still all your words, but it's been cleaned up. So it's far easier for anybody, kids included, to take that and to write their blog, their article, or their essay from it. There is a cost, and what I found is it's usually like $4, sometimes $5 to write a really long article. I personally think it's completely worth it if you have a child who's super stuck, because often over time, they're able to use it a little bit less. So those are writing strategies. You know, there are lots of strategies out there that we use when we're working with kids for writing. But sometimes, whether it's writing or any other subject, it's a factor of just getting started. So here's something that you can try at home. I am a huge fan of timers. I love timers. I think they're fabulous for kids from kindergarten to kids in college to adults. I like them because they often give us a sense of urgency to get going when we don't have an internal oomph to get started. So I like using a timer in a short variation of time. And by the way, this one's called a time timer, and I like it because it has this red floating disc. So often when kids see things like, if they set the timer on their phone for 15 minutes, they have 11 minutes and 14 seconds left. They don't have a sense of that. But with this, that red floating disc, it's so visual, kind of like a graphic organizer. It's much easier for them. So I recommend using a timer and set it for a super short period of time, maybe 10 minutes. We call this the tolerable 10. Anybody can tolerate anything just for 10 minutes. So you say to yourself, I'm going to work as hard as I can, as best I can, focus as much as I can, just for 10 minutes. And then I could take a break when the timer goes off. Typically, you can keep on going. So that's how to use a timer to get started on something. Some kids, however, will say to us, I like the timer idea, but it stresses me out. I don't want to use a timer. And then we'll talk to them about tasks, because our goal is to give them strategies that they can use on their own independently. So by task, that means the strategy might be, you know what, I'm going to write this topic sentence, and that's all I'm going to do today. Or I'll write this topic sentence, I'll take a break. Or these math problems, there's so many, I'm just going to do the even ones first, or the odd ones first, or the first 10 first. That's a strategy for getting started by task. Now, inevitably, if you're at home and you're helping your child, you may find, we'll talk a little bit about a parent's role in just a moment, but the reality is you're going to be in the thick of things every now and then, and you're going to want to help your child. And especially if you have a younger child who's really giving you a hard time, you want to give them space and time. So that means you want to say, hey, I can tell that you're frustrated. We're not working together well right now. I'm going to go over and do my email. Come get me if you need help. You can also contact the teacher and let her know what's going on, or him, at home. Use the words I've noticed. We'll talk a little bit about I've noticed later on because I think they're magic words. And you say, hey, I've noticed Susie's really having a hard time with writing at home. Do you have any suggestions for us? I like the words I've noticed because that sounds a lot more collaborative than, hey, the homework you're giving Susie in writing isn't working for us. She's throwing fits. That kind of puts the teacher on the defensive, but I noticed feels like you're a team. Oftentimes, if you find that there's tension in the relationship, that means it's time to do something different. And you may not be the best helper. You may still have good ideas, but your child isn't hearing it from you. And that is super typical. It's even more common when kids have ADHD or executive function issues. And in that case, you want to seek outside help. So outside help could be in the form of the teacher. It could be setting up a routine where your child meets with the teacher. It could be the college student down the street that works with your child. Or it could be a professional, which is what we do. We have specific people that specialize in writing and math and in executive function. And in fact, Jennifer Gonzalez is our program manager, and she's the person who speaks to parents that have these issues. This is her specialty. And she's happy to talk to you about the issues you're facing with your child to see if help could be a good thing. And you can get on her calendar by holding up your phone and scanning the QR code to schedule a free consultation to talk about issues that you're facing. So Jennifer is awesome. She's so friendly, and this is right up her alley. So she'd be more than happy to talk to you. All right, so we've talked about writing, we've talked about setting the stage. Let's shift gears a little bit into math. So here's the problem with math. It's cumulative. Unlike a lot of other subjects like history or English, in math, one skill builds upon another. We see the same thing in math-based sciences when kids are in high school, like chemistry and physics, and we see it in foreign languages. Those three subjects, math, foreign language, math-based science, they're all cumulative. Now, if it's okay with you, I'd love to take you back to the year of 1983. If you're my age, you may remember it. It was the year of the Love Boat, Flashdance, and Three's Company on TV. Here I am in 8th grade, sitting in the front row of my algebra class. And I say to myself, Anne, this is going to be the day. This is going to be the day you pay attention long enough to learn how to solve for X. I'd look up at the board and see my teacher droning on and on and on about how to go through these steps. And at the time, my neck ached, my shoulders were tense, and I thought, I'm never going to learn how to do this stuff, even though I really wanted to. Now, at home, my parents knew that I had a problem. And I remember vividly one day, my dad coming into my room and saying, Anne, it's okay, I'm going to help you with this algebra. Don't worry, we'll do it together. And honestly, who better to help me with my math than my engineering father? He loved numbers, he loved exactness, and he never got less than an A in math. So we sit down at my little yellow Ethan Allen desk, and we're solving through the first problem. And I say it's negative, and he says it's positive. And this goes back and forth until at one moment, my dad stands up, his face bright red, his lips pursed, takes my math book, and as hard as he can, he throws it against the wall, and papers fly everywhere. And I couldn't believe it. I stood up and I looked at my dad and said, Dad, what are you doing? It's only math. Now, my mom, hearing all this commotion, walks down the hall and says, that's it. You're getting a tutor. Now, at the time, in 8th grade, I thought this was positively the worst idea ever. Who needs a tutor? I didn't need a tutor. I could do this on my own. But my mom was right. I did need outside help. And here's the reason. I was a Swiss cheese kid, meaning that when I sat in class, even though I wanted to pay attention, I couldn't. and I would get bits and pieces of information. I had these holes in my learning, like Swiss cheese. And so I'd go home to do the work, and I kind of knew some things, but not everything. And I really didn't know how to do the homework well. So I'd either not do it at all, or I would slap something down on my paper to make it look like I did the homework, but I really didn't. And so it was Mr. Rogo, my tutor back then, that taught me actually I could learn in class, but I needed him. And ultimately, I did this on my own to preview what was coming, because when I had a sense of what was going to go on, it was so much easier for me to focus. He also taught me how to study for math, because at the time I thought, and I still hear this from kids, math, it's a subject. You either know it or you don't. You can't really study for math, which is completely untrue. So he taught me how to do a couple things. And probably the most important thing he taught me was how to create a practice test for myself. And this is like, I don't know, 30 years, no, more than 30 years ago, 35 years ago, even more than that. That strategy turns out that with math, it's the #1 strategy to learn it. So creating a study guide means when you're studying for a test, if your teacher doesn't give you one, that you go back and you pull out sample problems that you've already done, basically examples. You write down the problem and you create like a little test for yourself. And then you go through and you solve the problems. And when you're stuck, you have an example to look back at. That's the best way to practice math. And the other way that's super important is called distributive practice. So when kids say, when we say, go study for math, they don't know how, first of all. Before they see us, they come to the table, they say they study for math, and we'll say, how do you study for it? And they basically say, well, I take my notes and I read through them. That's not studying. So we teach them the study guide method, and then we teach them something called distributed practice, because there's a lot of research that shows for any test, for any subject, not just math, that you can, yes, study. If you have a test on Friday night, you can study on Thursday night for an hour, but you're actually going to retain more information later on, and really know those skills if you take that hour and you do 20 minutes Tuesday, 20 minutes Wednesday, 20 minutes Thursday. That's called distributed practice. And the reason this is valuable is not because you're practicing it, more times. It's because of sleep. Sleep is actually a study skill. And kids are surprised to hear that. But when you learn something and you sleep on it, it goes into your long-term memory. And then when you practice it again, it's solidified even more. So distributed practice and study guides are really important in math. Now, for younger kids that don't yet have tests, even the basics like creating organization can help with them. I remember, I taught elementary school along with other grades in Fairfax County. And I remember my first year that I taught in 4th grade. And I noticed that kids, when they would write down their problems, they did things like writing in a curvature, or their numbers were disorganized, or it was hard to read their numbers. And that's super common with kids with ADHD. So the basics of using graph paper can help your brain be a little bit more organized. And even if they're not doing computations, which we're really working towards getting them to problem solve, if they have word problems that are really hard for kids, they need to be drawing a picture. Kids with ADHD do far better with a visual. That's why things like the graphic organizers are so helpful. Drawing pictures for word problems and showing how to solve it is really valuable. So I've given you strategies, but you may come to the point where your child's doing the work and they're super stuck. What do you do in that instance? You have 3 choices. You can say, this is your homework, not mine. I already went to 5th grade. Do it on your own. It's not a great option, because we want our kids to come to us, not just for math homework, but if they're ever having difficulty with friends or other issues later on. We want to be seen as somebody that's helpful. You could also say, let me show you how to do it. This is how you do it. Inevitably, your child will say, that's not how my teacher said to do it. And the third option, which is the best option, is to say, do you have examples of this in your notes or in your book? Or did your teacher put the notes online that you can refer to? And this is really helpful because then you're not telling your child what to do. You're not totally backing off and helping at all. You're taking a middle ground in that you're saying, show me the example. You want your child to be independent. This is a skill they're going to need as they get older so that they can look back in their notes for examples. But ultimately, whether you're going to work with your child or you get help, which I recommend for kids that are struggling, because math in particular is a subject that you cannot teach yourself. Same with writing. Sometimes you can teach yourself things like history just by reading and taking notes, but other skills like writing and math are really, really hard for kids to catch up on their own if they're behind. So getting help is super beneficial to students. And what I've found is that consistency is key. And this is what a lot of research shows too, that when kids have support twice a week, it's far better than once a week or every now and then, because kids with ADHD, unlike typical learners, need to practice things over and over in order to get it. They need to practice skills over and over until they become a routine. And then a routine becomes a habit. So sessions that, it's again, with a teacher, with a professional, with somebody down the street, they need to be frequent and they need to be consistent so that there's also accountability on the other end. And often, when kids start getting help, they need a safety net, somebody to explain the concepts, make sure they're doing the work. But ultimately, this leads to independence later on, which is what we want for our kids. We ultimately want them to be doing these things on their own. So a parent's role ideally is on the sidelines. Just like you wouldn't go to your child's soccer game and jump into the game and start kicking the ball and running around. No, on the sidelines, you're going to be doing things like, that's awesome. I love the way you passed the ball to John. Great hustle. You're kind of like a cheerleader. And that's the approach you want for academics too. In fact, in my business, we see parents as the encouragers. They're on the sidelines. They're encouraging. They're setting the space up at their house that's ripe for motivation. They're reaching out for help when needed, but they're not doing the daily nitty-gritty work. It's somebody else that's really getting to the minutia so that there's not this power struggle between the parent and the child. Now, in your home, anytime you're dealing with issues, you want to have that positive relationship, and that is key. And so often when we see that our kids are struggling, and maybe that's not the case right now because school just started, but I can tell you it probably will be at some time in the year, you can say things like, hey, did you do that? Did you do this? Why didn't you turn this in? Why haven't you gone to see your teacher? Did you finish those test corrections? Why are you so far behind? How can you already have 3 missing assignments? It's only the 3rd week of school. That's not always helpful for kids. But using those magic words I mentioned before, I've noticed is really powerful. And I've noticed is just basically observing what you see, the observable. So if your child's struggling to keep on track with math, to get their assignments done, you want to say something like, I've noticed it's hard to stay on top of your math work. Or if it's something particular that they're struggling with, maybe a skill, you say, I've noticed equations are really hard. Tell me about that. And the reason you want to do this is to get your kids talking, to get into the conversation. I've noticed this, tell me about it and hear them out. Even if it's something negative. Oh, you know what? I have the worst math teacher in 9th grade. Nobody else gets this much homework. It's ridiculous. Oh, really? Tell me about that. I totally get it. What's going on? And in that time, we want to be really good listeners, even if we don't agree. It's okay. We don't want to give any advice. We want to listen, nod, and empathize. You're right. That's a tough situation. And if this would be helpful to you, if these are issues with your child, just basic communication and keeping it positive, I created a really great checklist of how to transform what we might say into what might be a little bit better. And these are word for word scripts that are super practical and can help you at home. So text that same number, 55444, the word communication, and it will come straight to your inbox. All right, so let's also be more specific and talk about kids' mindset. We want them to have a growth mindset and have a positive mindset. And to do that, we want to ask open-ended questions. So when we're asking those questions, like, I can tell this is difficult for you, you want to say additional things like, tell me more. Oh, what makes you say that? Or if your child has another way of doing something, you might say, oh, how would it work if you did that? So you're really asking open-ended questions. We also call these powerful questions because they really work. They take practice. You know, it's hard because if we're used to saying, did you do this? Did you do that? It takes thought and it takes lots of practice on our end as parents. We can also give praise differently. You know, we often say, good job or great job, but a better way, and this is one actually that one of my executive function coaches did for me, because I asked her, you know, what's a common feedback that you give? And she said, here's one that I use for the writing process. She said, that introduction makes me really want to read more of your paper. I thought that first point was very interesting. And the reason this works is because it's specific. It's not great job. Kids can see through that. They think that's run of the mill. You're not really paying attention. You're just kind of like brushing it off. But when you're specific and it's positive, that makes me really want more. I thought that was really interesting. Kids believe that we're on their side, that we're listening. And that helps them to go that next step to think about what else they're going to write. One other thing that we hear from parents that call our office looking for help for their kids is, and this is almost universal, regardless of the age, they report that their child doesn't advocate for themselves. So they'll say, why don't you ask your teacher? Or, oh, just email her about it, and they won't do it. A lot of the times kids don't do that because they don't know how to do it. And so instead of them being verbal and saying, I'm not quite sure how to do that, Mom, they just won't do it at all and won't give you that feedback. So we think that helping kids to communicate with their teacher is really important. And what we found is that once they reach out to their teacher and they get a positive response, they're much more likely to do it again and again. So here's a template. This is from a student that we work with that wrote an email to her teacher about help she needs. Let me read it to you. Dear Mrs. Smith, good morning. I'm writing to you about my algebra quiz corrections. When I log into Schoology, it shows as submitted. However, it has now been more than 2 weeks and there's no grade associated with this. Please let me know if something is missing or if you need me to resubmit it. Thanks for your time, and I will see you in class this afternoon. Mary. Oh my gosh, who wouldn't want their child to write such a nice email like this? We all would, but it seems like this would never happen. The truth is, it can happen, but kids need that, again, that visual framework. So this is one that we use in our practice when we're working with kids on advocacy. Dear teacher's name. It's basically like Mad Lib. It's fill in the blank. Every kid can do this. Good morning. All right. Now you're going to always include a brief friendly greeting. That's what you put here. Next, I'm writing to you about blank. Explain what the problem is and what you've already done to address it. Next, let me know if what you're asking your teacher to do or what you need to do next. So kids can do this, but they need help getting started initially. And if this would be helpful to you, you can have this template that we use. Use the same number, 55444, and this time type in the word advocacy and it will be sent to you. So ultimately, we believe that parents are here to be the encouragers, to set up the environment for motivation, and to reach out for help. Because ultimately, as parents, we want to preserve relationships with our kids. We want to keep it positive. There's research that shows that kids with ADHD, 80% of the feedback they get in school is negative. So if we can shift the table, if we can shift that narrative to being positive at home, outside of school, it can have a tremendously good impact on our students. So thank you. As we wrap up, I want to share again Jennifer's information. Again, she's the one who's the expert in these things, and she's happy to talk to you about your child. You can schedule a free 20-minute consult with her by scanning this QR code. All right, and my name is Ann Dolan. Thank you for listening. We're going to go to Q&A in just a second. So if you have a question, please go ahead to the chat feature right now and put it in. And then Mary Beth will read off our questions. All right, Mary Beth, should I turn it over to you now?
Okay, thank you. And thank you, Anne, for that wonderful presentation. So we do have quite a few questions already in the chat. People have been adding them as you've been going along. So let's start with the first one. How do you avoid distractions when your child has to do everything on the computer, but the computer itself is a distraction?
Oh, I hear you. Okay, so there are a couple things. One, there are a whole litany of programs that are website blockers. So a website blocker is basically a program that allows kids to either blacklist or whitelist the programs that they want to use. So blacklist means I don't want to go. Kids can always tell us what's distracting to them. You know, they'll often say something like YouTube. So we'll say, what are the sites that are distracting to you when you do your homework? Okay, let's go into, like, one of them is called Stay Focused. There's lots of them, but just type in website blockers and it will allow you to blacklist those sites. Some of the website blockers, Focus Booster is another one that I really, really like. It's based on the Pomodoro method. So it sets it for 25 minutes at a time. It allows you to whitelist the sites that you only want to go to. So those might be Schoology, it might be your online book, whatever you need for your work, and you can only go to those. So with website blockers, whether you try to disable the app or restart your computer, you can't go to those sites for a specific amount of time that you determine. When we work with kids, we're always talking about, we're trying to help them predict what could get in their way. And this is a good question that we use. Okay, so, now you have your plan of what you're going to do. What could get in your way? What if you want to start studying for math, but you get distracted? What are some things that can happen? And the kids are honest. They'll say, well, if I have my phone there, then I might get into a group chat, or, oh my gosh, I really love this particular website and it's hard for me not to be on it. So we'll say, what are the strategies that you can use if you feel like that? And they'll say, oh, I could use this website blocker. I might use a timer. I might put my phone in the other room. And so predicting that there will be distractions is really helpful for kids.
Great, thanks, Anne. I love those website blockers. I think those would be really, really important because we have a lot of children who the computer is one of their biggest distractions. All right, so we have a mom who's asking, who had indicated that her child was diagnosed with ADHD this past spring, and really would like him or her to take medication along with doing some therapy. And I know you're not a therapist, Anne, but in your experience, are there certain types of therapies or treatments that might be helpful? And then a second part to this is, what age would you recommend kind of executive functioning coaching?
Well, there's lots of different kinds of therapy. I'm a huge believer in therapy. I think it's super helpful for kids. And sometimes our kids aren't just struggling with focus issues, but sometimes there's that anxiety component, which we haven't really talked about today, but it's real and it's like so prevalent right now. And sometimes, we think that kids procrastinate because they just don't want to do something, but sometimes they become perfectionists and they won't do something because they're worried that it won't be perfect. And in those cases, sometimes it is an academic issue, but those things are rooted in anxiety, and there are treatments specifically for that. So if you need a referral, let me know. You can email me, Ann at EC Tutoring, and I'm happy to give that to you. But there are people that specialize in that type of thing. But for executive function coaching, we do that really for kids starting in elementary school. And it's basically how to get yourself situated and focused when it comes to work, how to create, how to prioritize your assignments. But more recently, kids just don't have a lot of work. So often it's other things that we do, like creating a launching pad for getting organized at home. There are other things for young children that can make a big difference in their lives that may not be solely academic.
Great, thank you. So another parent is asking about, how do you really get your child to practice or do these things kind of daily? Um, you know, she's indicated it's kind of a constant struggle, especially when their child doesn't understand the material, and yet we want them to practice and continue to do it. How do you motivate that?
I guess it depends what it is that you want to practice. First, if it's not that important, then I might leave it alone. I try to, whenever working with kids, well, just as a parent, you know, it just may be so wrought for frustration that when a child is upset, there's a part of their brain called the amygdala, and it's the part of your brain that's responsible for emotions. So when somebody's upset, not just a child, it could be your spouse, your amygdala is really on fire. And when that happens, your frontal lobe goes offline. And so you're not able to really focus and do the work. And so if you find that there's a lot of tension over something and your child's become emotional, I would just back off and I would talk to the teacher about other things that would be helpful. I also would maybe think about things in smaller doses and making it fun. For example, last night, Mary Beth, we had somebody ask how to teach multiplication facts. So if that's the type of practice that you mean, there's so many fun things out there, like there are beach balls with facts on them. And I've done that with kids, where I throw the ball wherever their left thumb touches, they say the fact. So when that's fun, their amygdala is not on fire and they can think correctly. So I might back off and talk to the teacher. And then if there's something they really, really need to practice, make it fun and make it super short.
Thank you. So another parent is asking about, their child has ADHD and really struggles with test taking, and oftentimes I think students with ADHD often aren't great test takers.
Mm.
How might a parent collaborate and work with the school to kind of help that situation?
Mhm. Yeah, you're right, Mary Beth. I see that a lot. Kids that, they might be doing the work. Some of the kids we work with, actually, it's pretty common. They're pretty motivated. They want to do well. So they do the work, they do the homework. They participate in class, but their retention of information isn't great. So there's two reasons this happens. One is they really do experience physiological symptoms when they're in a test-taking situation, like a grumbling tummy or palms sweaty. Those are all signs that you're feeling anxious. And when you're super anxious, again, your amygdala is fired up and your frontal lobe is offline. So you really have a hard time recalling information. The other issue is really when kids aren't studying correctly. And to really know information, you have to use all three modalities: auditory, visual, kinesthetic. And sometimes kids might practice the information one way, but the format of the test is another way. That's why practice tests are so valuable. And so for those kids, we work with them on better study habits and better ways to study instead of what they're doing. So I would delve into those two issues to determine which one it is.
Awesome, thank you. And I have to share, it took my daughter probably till she went to college to kind of figure out how to really study, because I do think she has some undiagnosed ADD things going on. And the pr- I so appreciated your example of the practice test, because that's what she started to do. And exponentially her test scores came up and she felt more prepared. So, you know, for those of you out there listening, I say it is really an opportunity to pull those examples in and to make little practice tests. So that's a wonderful study strategy. So thank you for sharing that, Anne.
Sure. And Mary Beth, I might add, if that feels overwhelming for a parent, and it probably
Hmm.
is, like these are strategies that we use with kids. If your child gets a study guide, you can make it, you can kind of use it in the same way. So what I would recommend with a study guide is what usually happens is kids get the study guide and they kind of fill it out in class, or maybe some of it in class and some on their own, and they just look at it and say they've studied. But really, if you can make 3 copies of that study guide, so they do the first one in class, um, or on their own, and it's the correct one. Then you have 2 more blank copies. The next blank copy they do at home for homework or for study time, and they work as hard as they can without referring to the first one. They really have to pull it from memory. And when they're super stuck, then they can go back and look at the first one for the answers. And then the next day, you use the third one. And by this time, they really should have mastery of the information. They can always refer back if they need to, but that makes your brain work hard. That is active learning and not passive, which is just looking at the study guide.
No, thank you. No, that's a great suggestion. Um, so we had actually some parents had just asked again that the names for the website blocker sites that you had
Oh,
mentioned.
sure. Okay, so there's one called Focus Booster. That's the one that's based on the Pomodoro method, which basically is that this is really for older kids, like middle, high school, college students. The sweet spot for your attention is about 25 minutes. Anything more than that, it's really hard for kids to stay focused and to attend to a task, especially if it's hard for them. So Focus Booster is based on 25 minutes increments that you set it for. There's also Stay Focused, which is a Chrome extension. And then there's another one that kids with Macs use, and I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. It will come to me, but there's lots of them out there, and you can just Google them and find a website blocker that you can use and just test it out. So when we use these, we really include the kid in the process. We don't say, oh my gosh, you're so distracted, you need to use this, because the student is going to say, no, I don't. That's stupid. I'm not distracted. But we'll use it in a different way where we'll say, oh, what do you anticipate happening? What could get in your way? Oh, I have an idea. This is how I found this to be helpful to some of my other students that have the same exact issue. It's super common. So we try to normalize the situation. And then we'll say, could this work for you? Let's try it out. Let's pull this one up and test it out and see if it would be helpful. And that's the route you want to go, not mandating it, but just saying like, this could work. It might not. Let's try it out. You're kind of like being a detective.
Oh, great, thank you. And I know Melissa was able to put some of the actually websites in there for families to take a look at. So Melissa, thank
Great.
you for that as well. So another a parent of a first grader, said, he's not bringing homework home yet, but his teachers are not necessarily happy about him rolling around on the floor, getting chatty, getting upset when it's time to complete assignments and classes up.
Mhm.
What can this parent do to perhaps support good classroom behavior and focus from home?
Mhm. That is so hard, because it's harder to ask really young questions, young kids, like, tell me about that. How are you feeling? Because they sometimes don't have the words for it. But I would ask the teacher, like, what is happening before that? Or when is he specifically doing it? Because I do not think he's doing it all day long. He's probably doing it out of frustration or boredom. So figuring out what is the trigger for that and then addressing that, and maybe even practicing it at home. I think role playing is super helpful for kids. Even if you role play like, okay, we're going out for the evening. Let's say you guys get in an argument about what you're going to watch on TV. Let's practice how that might go. So you want to watch this and you want to watch that. What do you do in this case? How could you work it out? And you role play. You can do that with a first grader too. Let's say it's reading time and your teacher wants you to sit in a circle. Let's practice what you might do. So you may have to at home practice, first of all, figure out when this is occurring and then practice those behaviors, because if you're just corrected, the child may really not know what to do.
Yeah. No, thank you. Yeah, that finding that antecedent is so important. Um, so another parent is asking about any tips for creating a good homework space for kids with the ADHD inattentive type.
Mhm.
Um, Anything else that helps them thrive, timers, etc.
Yeah, so with kids that are inattentive, and it really depends on the age of your child, but I probably wouldn't isolate them. And that's, something that happens a lot because we think, oh my gosh, my child's distracted. He needs it to be super quiet, which
Right.
doesn't really work. That's why you see, you go to Starbucks for a cup of coffee and you see people sitting there with their laptops and, they're basically their whole office is there. They may as well have a printer. And the reason that is because they need the hum of a busy area. And that actually helps, that gives them more energy and focus. So, if isolation isn't really working for your child, I might, experiment with different places and see, is the kitchen table good, or is that too much going on there? Is it like the home office, or I personally like the dining room? That tends to be a good place because it's not like right in the middle of things, but it's also not too isolated where you can check in. I do like using timers. I also like using little things like fidgets and having those available for kids. So you can say, when you feel distracted, could this be helpful? And a fidget has been shown to really help kids increase their attention. It gives them something to do, especially if they're reading or they're working on something hard. They hold it in their non-writing hand, and it just helps to elevate their attention a little bit. So I definitely keep a timer. I would teach your child how to use it and practice it over and over. Give them a fidget, and make also sure that if for a first grader, you have the correct pencil grips, so it's not laborious when they're having to write.
Right, thank you. So mom's asking, she has two middle schoolers, and she's concerned that, you know, how do I dial some of this back as they head into high school? You know, how
Yeah.
much support is the right amount of support?
So in general, really by ninth grade, the goal for elementary school is to be a proving ground for middle and middle for high school. So the fact that this mom is already thinking ahead is amazing. And you should be commended for that, mom, because a lot of times we just want to get through the day and we don't think about the future. It's easy to do just to kind of keep the peace. But when you do think about the future, you're thinking, what can I do now to make my child independent later? So by ninth grade, they should be pretty independent, ideally. Kids with ADHD, we know they're about, 2 to 3 years behind. So it may be a little bit later for them. But in general, right now, you might want to ask two questions for each child. What do you have? And when will you do it? Or what are your priorities today? So basically, you're asking them, what are the things that you want to get accomplished? And if they don't have much work, you might say, what would be the one thing you got done today that would make you feel really good? Like you check this off your list. And then the focus is really just that they do that one thing. I don't know if that's always realistic though, but sometimes when kids feel overwhelmed, just starting with that one thing is helpful. But in general, that equates to, I'm going to help you get started to understand what you have, even if they're not super verbal back to you, just asking those questions. Um, you might even say, can you pull up what you have going on? Okay, great. And then walk away. So in general, helping them get started and then walk away is great. If you have kids though that are not consistently following through and turning things in, you might have a reoccurring meeting with them, say every Friday, where you look at Schoology or whatever platform is, and you say, would it be okay if we looked at this together? So you don't want to look at it without them and see these missing assignments and get really upset. That doesn't work because sometimes there's a reason. So including them in on the discussion and not passing judgment like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you already have 3 assignments. Why didn't you turn this in? You said you did it. Instead, you're just saying, tell me about that. Uh-huh. And just being aware of it, that means they're aware of it. Because a lot of times kids with ADHD, they really don't know what they have to do or they've forgotten about it. So having a regularly occurring time to take a look at their portal can be really helpful.
Okay, so I know we're kind of getting to the end of our time. And um, I would like to ask one more question. So, what are some non-school related activities that you might recommend that would help kids build strategies that they can utilize in school or academic life?
I think anytime a child plays a sport, whether it's an individual sport like karate or a team sport like soccer, that is amazing. And for so many reasons, like we all know that, aerobic exercise increases attention, but it also helps kids with time management because they have to juggle that in school. But I also like it for the organizational aspect of, all right, what are the things that you need for hockey practice each time you go? Let's create a checklist. And you have, hopefully it's not too many things because that can be overwhelming, but you put the essentials onto a checklist. You post that checklist by the door in which they're going to exit from, and they're responsible for their things. You might have to sparkleize it and make it more interesting as time goes on because it kind of can blend in with the wall. We call that sparkleizing something. But that kind of visual, again, is super helpful for a sport because it's teaching that executive function skill of planning ahead and being organized.
Okay, and I lied. I'm going to ask you one more question because
Sure.
I think this is a really important one, and I know that um, at Educational Connections, you all are doing a lot of working with kids prepping for college and that kind of thing. So I think this is a really appropriate question for you. Do you have any conversation starters for a high school senior who is overwhelmed by the college search application process, completely shutting down, including even communicating with the counselor?
Oh my gosh, we see that a lot. In fact, in March, we started a college counseling division in our company because that was so common in the students we worked with. And now we have 3 super experienced college counselors on staff. It's just grown so much in a short time because there's just a need. And for this reason, it feels like, oh, if you really wanted to go to college, you would do these things on your own. But I tell you, there is no time, I promise you, there is no time in your child's educational career that their executive function skills are tested more than with college applications. It's so much to deal with. And so often kids, even though they really do want to go to college, they do shut down because it's so much to do. It's so different than when we were kids. There's a Common App essay, but then each school has their own essays, and it's just a lot. So I would look for outside help. If your child isn't willing to work with you and they're really shutting down, they've got one shot at this. And just telling them to do it or create a spreadsheet or, just do a little bit each day may not move the needle, especially right now because it's so late in the game. I'm happy to help you and talk to you about options, but I'm thinking bringing somebody else in right now would really be the ticket for getting him over the hump.
All right, Anne. Well, thank you again. And thank you so much for being with us this morning. And please, I just want to say, please reach out to Anne and her group if you have any other questions and would like to follow up with them. And then certainly if you're looking for some other resources or need any help from us at the Parent Resource Center, please do give us a call or shoot us an email and we would be happy to help you as well. So again, Anne, thank you so much for joining us and thank you everyone for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me, Mary Beth. And to all the parents, thank you for being here. I wish you all the very best for the school year. Have a great